Imagine this for a moment. Today you have $100 in your pocket. 1 year from now, you still have $100. Sounds like the same amount of money, right? But the truth is, it isn't. Listen carefully. Because 1 year from now, you may not be able to buy everything with that $100 that you can buy today. The money looks the same, but its value has changed. And that's the most interesting thing about inflation. This is where the difference lies. It works silently. It doesn't knock on your door. It doesn't warn you. But over time, it reduces the purchasing power of the money in your pocket. So why does this keep happening? Why does almost every generation live through the same story? To understand that, we need to go back a little. In the early 20th century, money wasn't as flexible as it is today. Many countries were using the gold standard. Every banknote was backed by physical gold. The advantage of this system was simple. Governments couldn't print money whenever they wanted. If they spent too much, there was a price to pay. They had to borrow money, raise taxes, or admit their mistakes. In short, money was under much tighter control. But then the world faced major crises. First came the Great Depression. Millions of people lost their jobs. Companies went bankrupt. Banks collapsed. People stopped spending. People went hungry. And it became clear that inflation wasn't always the biggest threat facing an economy. Sometimes the opposite could be just as dangerous. Deflation. A situation where prices keep falling. At first glance, that sounds great. Who wouldn't want cheaper products? But if people believe prices will be even lower tomorrow, they stop buying today. Companies can't sell their products. Production declines. Unemployment rises. And the economy slowly begins to freeze. This period completely changed the way economists thought about money. Then came World War II. When the war ended, countries were left with enormous debts. The debts were so large that paying them back through normal means could have taken decades. And that's when many governments realized something important. Inflation was reducing the real value of debt. On paper, the debt remained the same, but as the value of money declined, carrying that debt became easier. This discovery became one of the most important turning points in modern economic history. Because leaders realized something, controlled inflation could sometimes ease problems that seemed impossible to solve. And over time, that idea became deeply embedded in the modern economic system. Then came 1971. To most people, it probably seemed like an ordinary year. But from an economic perspective, it was one of the moments that changed the rules of the game. That year, the United States ended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The decision was originally presented as temporary. Believe it or not, it never was. And from that moment on, the nature of money began to change. In the past, every banknote was backed by a specific amount of gold. Now, the value of money depended largely on people's confidence in it. It sounds simple, but the consequences were enormous, because the financial system suddenly became much more flexible. Governments could borrow more. Banks could issue more loans. Economies could grow faster. Of course, there was a price to pay. Inflation was no longer an occasional problem. It became a natural part of the system. And over time, investors realized something important. If inflation was going to continue, simply saving money wouldn't be enough, because money sitting in a bank account was losing value every year. So people started putting their money to work. They bought houses, they bought land, they bought stocks. They invested in businesses because while the value of those assets tended to rise over time, cash often did not. And this is where things get interesting. Imagine two people. One has $1 million sitting in the bank. The other used a $1 million loan to buy a house. And here's the interesting part. The wealthy often seem to come out ahead. Years pass. Inflation rises. House prices rise. The debt remains the same. Eventually, the homeowner's wealth grows, while the purchasing power of the cash holder declines. That's why many wealthy people don't necessarily fear inflation. Instead, they learn how to position themselves around it. Because they don't simply save money, they convert money into assets, houses, businesses, stocks, land, things that have the potential to grow in value over time. At this point, an important rule of the system becomes clear. Inflation often punishes idle cash while rewarding productive assets. That's why some people watch economic crises with fear, while others see opportunity. Because the same economic event doesn't affect everyone equally. What you own matters, and perhaps the most important question begins here. Listen carefully. If inflation has such a powerful impact, who actually benefits from it? Who loses? And why does the modern system continue this cycle? That's where the story becomes truly interesting. Now let's go a little deeper. Because inflation doesn't affect everyone in the same way, in fact, two people living in the same country can experience completely different outcomes. Think about someone who works for a salary. Every month they earn a regular income, but grocery prices keep rising, rent goes up. Electricity, water, fuel, everything becomes more expensive. Their salary may increase too, but often not as fast as prices do. As a result, they can end up feeling like they're working harder than ever while standing in exactly the same place. Now think about someone else. They own a house. Maybe they have a few investment accounts. Maybe they own shares in a company. When inflation rises, the value of those assets often rises as well. So the exact same economic environment that creates hardship for one person can create opportunity for another. That's why, in economics, it's not only about how much money you make, it's also about where your money sits. Most people spend their entire lives focused on earning more money, but wealthy people often ask a different question. How can my money work for me? And the small difference in thinking can create enormous differences over time. Then there's the debt side of the story. For most people, debt sounds like something negative, and often that's true. Uncontrolled debt can create serious problems. But not all debt is the same. For example, high-interest credit card debt can trap people for years. But a long-term fixed-rate mortgage is a completely different story. Because as inflation rises, the real burden of those future payments can become smaller. A payment that feels heavy today may feel much lighter years from now. That's why some people in the financial world don't always see debt as a burden. Sometimes they see it as a tool. Of course, only when it's used correctly. Used carelessly, that same tool can become a disaster. And that's where knowledge becomes important. Because within the same economic system, some people learn the rules of the game. Others simply live with the consequences. And history shows us something interesting. When knowledge and capital come together, advantages tend to multiply. But the biggest turning point was still ahead. In 2008, the world experienced one of the largest financial crises in modern history. Banks were in trouble, markets were collapsing, people were panicking. Many believed the entire system would change forever. But what happened next was very different. Central banks and governments stepped in. They provided support on a scale the world had never seen before, and the effects of those decisions would shape the years that followed. After the 2008 crisis, the world entered a new era. Back then, everyone turning on the television saw the same headlines. Banks were struggling. Major corporations were under pressure. Markets were falling. People feared losing their jobs. Many believed this would be a complete reset of the economic system. Maybe everything would start over. But that's not what happened. Instead, central banks stepped in. Interest rates were cut. Huge amounts of money were injected into the financial system. The goal was simple: prevent the system from collapsing. And in the short term, it worked. Markets recovered, banks survived, companies stayed afloat. But over time, something interesting happened. Stock markets started climbing. Home prices started rising. Investment assets gained value. Yet many people's wages didn't grow at the same pace. As a result, many people never truly felt the recovery in their own lives. They heard that the economy was improving. But at the grocery store, at the gas station, and when paying rent, it didn't feel that way. And this continued for years. Then came 2020. And once again the world faced a major crisis. The pandemic brought daily life almost to a standstill. It was a very difficult time. Businesses closed, travel stopped, production slowed down. Millions of people were forced to stay home. This time, governments responded even more aggressively. Companies received support. Citizens received financial aid. Massive amounts of money flowed into the economy. At first, the goal was simply to keep people and businesses alive. But after a while, a new problem appeared. People had money to spend. But production couldn't keep up. Supply chains were still struggling. Products were delayed, costs were rising, and eventually inflation returned to the center of public attention. This time people could feel it everywhere: on grocery receipts, in rent agreements, at gas stations, in restaurant bills, everywhere. For the first,